I'll go back to
What if the biggest shock of the 2026 World Cup is not happening inside the stadiums at all? Across America, cities are filling with European visitors who expected the version of the country they had seen in headlines, only to find something far harder to dismiss once they lived it. So what happens when the place you were warned about becomes the place you do not want to leave? New York won them. There's something almost funny about crossing the Atlantic with a suitcase full of expectations, only to discover that the America waiting on the other side looks nothing like the version you had been warned about. During the 2026 World Cup, New York became one of those places where the difference was impossible to ignore. European visitors arrived expecting a chaotic American megacity they had already seen dissected 1,000 times in headlines, documentaries, political debates, and viral clips. Then they stepped onto the sidewalk and found something far harder to fit into a gloomy headline. A city that was exhausting, generous, theatrical, efficient in strange ways, and ridiculously easy to become attached to. New York does not introduce itself politely, it arrives all at once, like somebody opening 5 browser tabs, ordering coffee, hailing a cab, and arguing about baseball before you have even put your luggage down. For visitors from cities such as Copenhagen, Vienna, or Amsterdam, where historic centers can feel carefully measured around pedestrians, bicycles, and compact neighborhoods, Manhattan operates on another scale. The avenues stretch so far that a 10-minute walk can quietly turn into a personal negotiation with your shoes. Buildings rise above the street like they are competing for the last available patch of sky, and a convenience store can stay open at an hour when half of Europe has already turned the lights off. Yet the size is only the first surprise. What tends to stay with people is how quickly New York makes strangers part of the machinery. Ask for directions and somebody may answer while still walking. Look confused at a subway map, and there is a decent chance another passenger will point toward the right platform without turning the moment into a ceremony. It is a very American kind of friendliness. Less tea and biscuits hospitality, more you need the A train, buddy, move before the doors close. That casual openness can feel especially unusual to visitors from parts of Northern Europe, where personal space is often treated with almost diplomatic respect. In Finland, for example, quiet public behavior and generous physical distance between strangers are familiar social habits. New York plays by different rules. Somebody compliments your jersey in an elevator, a waiter asks where you're from, and suddenly a conversation with a stranger has lasted longer than the subway ride itself. Nobody scheduled the interaction. America simply happened to you. And perhaps that is where the real charm begins. New York is expensive, noisy, crowded, and completely unapologetic about all four, yet it also gives visitors a kind of permission to participate. You do not need generations of local history before ordering a bacon, egg, and cheese from the corner deli, cheering beside strangers in a sports bar, or eating pizza on the sidewalk while yellow cabs slide past like moving pieces of the city's logo. That is difficult to explain through television alone. From overseas, America can sometimes look like one endless political argument with highways attached. On the ground, however, New York feels much more human. It is a grandmother holding the door, a deli worker remembering an order, a police officer answering a tourist question, a stranger laughing because somebody mispronounced Houston Street exactly the way every newcomer eventually does. The World Cup may have provided the ticket across the Atlantic, but New York supplied a different reason to linger. After enough mornings with oversized coffee, late-night food, strangers who talk to you as if you already belong, and a city that somehow keeps offering another thing to do at midnight, the flight home begins to feel less like the end of a vacation and more like somebody closing the party while the music is still playing. Space feels illegal. Los Angeles has a peculiar talent for making European instincts feel slightly underprepared. The first clue is not Hollywood palm trees or celebrity sightings. It is the simple realization that the city seems to keep going long after your internal sense of city says it should have ended. That difference matters because Los Angeles is built around a very American idea. Space is something to use generously. According to the US Census Bureau, the city of Los Angeles occupies roughly 469 square miles of land. Paris proper covers only about 41 square miles. Put those numbers beside each other and the joke almost writes itself. You could fit Paris inside Los Angeles more than 11 times and still have room left over for somebody to complain about traffic on the 405. For Europeans arriving during the 2026 World Cup, that physical scale can completely rearrange what nearby means. In compact cities such as Barcelona, Amsterdam, or central London, crossing several neighborhoods may involve a short metro ride followed by a pleasant walk. Los Angeles treats distance differently. A restaurant can be close while still requiring 20 minutes behind a steering wheel, and two places appearing almost shoulder to shoulder on a tourist map may actually be separated by enough asphalt to reconsider your afternoon plans. From overseas, that can look excessive. Once experienced as, however, the appeal becomes much easier to understand. American space creates a strange kind of everyday comfort. Parking lots are designed around actual cars rather than vehicles being folded into medieval streets like luggage into an overhead bin. Grocery runs do not require carrying 6 bags through 3 train stations. A family can leave a stadium, load coolers, jackets, souvenirs, and half a week's worth of enthusiasm into one vehicle, then head somewhere completely different without rebuilding the entire trip around a rail timetable. That freedom becomes especially noticeable when compared with older European cities whose street plans were established centuries before automobiles existed. Central Florence, for example, was never designed for an SUV because Renaissance planners had other priorities. Amsterdam's historic canal belt is brilliantly suited to bicycles and walking, but nobody in the 17th century was reserving space for a Costco parking lot. America arrived later, had more room, and frequently designed around movement at a completely different scale. Los Angeles may be the clearest expression of that philosophy. The freeway is not merely transportation here, it is practically connective tissue. Beaches, mountain trails, stadiums, suburban neighborhoods, Korean barbecue, Mexican markets, movie studios, and desert landscapes can all belong to the same day if somebody is willing to drive. That is where the supposed inconvenience starts turning into temptation. Visitors who once laughed at Americans for driving everywhere can begin understanding why the car keys are always near the front door. It is not simply dependence. In a place this spread out, the car becomes a passport to possibilities. And perhaps that is why Los Angeles grows on people slowly, then all at once. European cities often reward closeness. Los Angeles rewards range. One culture teaches you how much life can fit into a small radius, while this corner of America shows how much life becomes reachable when the radius itself gets enormous. By the end, those 6-lane roads stop looking quite so ridiculous. They start looking suspiciously like freedom with cup holders. The lake looks fake. Chicago has a way of playing one very unfair trick on first-time visitors. It calls Lake Michigan a lake, then presents something that looks suspiciously like an inland ocean. That single detail says more about the American experience than another round of skyscraper photos ever could. Lake Michigan covers about 22,400 square miles according to the US Environmental Protection Agency, making it larger than countries such as Croatia. Its shoreline stretches for roughly 1,600 miles, and from Chicago, the opposite side simply disappears beyond the horizon. For Europeans used to city rivers such as the Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, or the Spree in Berlin, the visual scale can be almost comically misleading. You expect a waterfront. Chicago gives you waves, beaches, sailboats, blue horizon, and enough open water to make your brain quietly ask whether somebody mislabeled the Atlantic. That is the addictive part worth looking at closely, because American cities often offer nature without requiring people to leave urban life behind. Chicago is still unmistakably a major metropolis. Trains rattle overhead, traffic rolls through the loop, office towers crowd the skyline, and restaurants stay busy deep into the evening. Yet only minutes away, people are running beside water that looks endless, cycling along the lakefront trail, sitting on beaches, or watching sailboats move beneath a wall of skyscrapers. The contrast is almost absurdly American. In many European capitals, dramatic natural landscapes usually require some distance from the urban center. Paris has the Seine, which is beautiful but comparatively narrow. Madrid has parks and the Manzanares, yet nobody stands beside it wondering whether they have accidentally reached the Mediterranean. Berlin has lakes around the city and wonderful access to nature, although its central identity still feels more terrestrial than coastal. Chicago somehow behaves like a city that stole somebody else's shoreline and refused to give it back. That matters because it changes how a visitor experiences urban life. A packed day does not necessarily end inside a building. You can leave downtown, walk toward the water, take off your shoes on a beach, and still see the skyline sitting behind you like a movie backdrop that forgot to go home. This is where the common overseas picture of American cities can begin to crack. The United States is often presented through highways, downtown towers, suburban development, and endless debates about cars. Chicago adds something harder to stereotype. Public shoreline on a continental scale, the Chicago Park District manages more than 24 beaches along the lakefront, while the lakefront trail runs about 18.5 miles. That means this enormous body of freshwater is not decorative scenery reserved for luxury hotels. It is woven into ordinary life. People jog beside it before work, bring children there on summer afternoons, cycle past it after dinner, and treat a horizon worthy of a vacation postcard like the neighborhood backyard. For someone arriving during the 2026 World Cup, that can become surprisingly difficult to give up. A match may bring people into town, but the deeper attachment comes later, when a normal Tuesday evening includes cool lake air, a public beach, downtown lights, and enough blue water to make home suddenly feel very far away. Europe has extraordinary coastlines, lakes, and historic waterfronts, and nobody needs to diminish them to appreciate what Chicago offers. The American twist is the combination. Giant city energy pressed directly against giant country geography. Perhaps that is why Chicago stays in the mind after the stadium empties. The city does not ask you to choose between downtown and the outdoors. It casually gives you both, then calls the ocean-sized part a lake. Smoke wins. Everyone Kansas City may be the place where a European visitor learns that in America, dinner can behave like a civic institution. The clue is in the smoke. During the 2026 World Cup, people arriving for soccer can easily discover that barbecue here is not treated as a special occasion novelty or a weekend experiment with a backyard grill. It is woven into the city's identity so deeply that arguing over brisket, burnt ends, ribs, sauce, wood, and technique can sound almost as serious as discussing a starting lineup. That is a very different relationship with food from what many Europeans are used to. In France, regional cuisine is tied to terroir, tradition, and technique. In Italy, recipes can carry family loyalties strong enough to turn the wrong pasta shape into a minor diplomatic incident. Kansas City understands that level of devotion perfectly. It simply applies the same seriousness to meat cooked low and slow over smoke. According to Visit KC, the metropolitan area has more than 100 barbecue restaurants, while Kansas City's barbecue tradition stretches back more than a century. The city is also home to the Kansas City Barbecue Society, one of the world's best-known organizations devoted to competitive barbecue. In other words, this is not a town that merely enjoys smoked meat. It has built rules, competitions, reputations, rivalries, and entire family histories around it. The addictive part is not the portion size, although American barbecue trays can make a European lunch plate look as if it arrived during the appetizer round. What pulls people in is the lack of ceremony. You can sit at a table with butcher paper, plastic cups, sauce on your fingers, and strangers discussing which place does burn ends properly, and nobody is trying to make the meal look elegant. The food has already done enough work. A brisket may have spent 10 or 12 hours in a smoker, yet it arrives with the attitude of a guy wearing work boots who has absolutely no interest in explaining himself. That combination feels unusually American. Enormous effort hidden beneath complete informality. Compare it with fine dining culture in Paris or Copenhagen, where presentation can be part of the experience and a dish may arrive looking carefully composed down to the final herb. Kansas City barbecue often goes in the opposite direction. Meat gets sliced, piled onto a tray, handed across a counter, and trusted to defend its own reputation. And somehow that confidence becomes part of the attraction. There's also something social about it that is easy to underestimate from overseas. Barbecue here is rarely just fuel. It belongs to game days, family gatherings, neighborhood conversations, road trips, work lunches, and arguments over sauce that nobody actually intends to resolve. Food becomes a reason to stay at the table another 20 minutes. That matters during something as international as the World Cup. Visitors may arrive carrying familiar European ideas about American cuisine, being mostly fast food, oversized chains, and processed convenience. Kansas City quietly ruins that stereotype with smoke, patience, regional pride, and a cooking tradition that asks for hours before anybody gets fed. The irony is wonderful. America is often described as impatient, yet one of its most beloved food cultures is built around waiting half a day for dinner. By the time somebody has learned the difference between brisket and burnt ends, sampled 2 rival sauces, and developed an opinion nobody asked for, Kansas City has already completed the conversion. The match may last 90 minutes, but the barbecue argument can follow you all the way home. Parking lot party. Dallas may deliver one of the funniest cultural surprises of the 2026 World Cup before anyone even reaches a stadium seat, because in America, the parking lot can become part of the sporting event. That sounds almost ridiculous until you see how seriously Americans have perfected tailgating. Folding chairs come out, coolers open, portable grills start smoking, team flags appear from car trunks, somebody has brought enough food for a small wedding, and strangers who parked beside each other 20 minutes earlier are suddenly discussing the game, as though they have shared season tickets since kindergarten. What looks from a distance like people refusing to go inside is actually one of America's most recognizable sports rituals. Dallas is an especially fitting place to encounter it. AT&T Stadium in nearby Arlington normally seats around 80,000 spectators and can expand to hold more than 100,000 for major events. The building itself is enormous, but the more revealing American detail is everything surrounding it. Roads, parking areas, cars, food, music, and thousands of people turning arrival time into its own event rather than treating it as dead time before kickoff. For many European football supporters, that rhythm feels very different. In England, matchday culture often begins in pubs near the ground, on trains packed with supporters, or along streets leading toward the turnstiles. German football has its own deeply rooted traditions around beer gardens, supporter marches, public transportation, and stadium neighborhoods. Those cultures are vibrant precisely because they grew around dense European cities where many fans arrive without cars. Dallas gives the same basic human instinct, a completely American piece of real estate. Instead of squeezing the pregame gathering into a pub, America looks at several acres of asphalt and apparently decides, well, we already paid for the parking spot, so we might as well cater lunch. That practicality is part of the charm. Tailgating turns a car into a tiny clubhouse. The trunk becomes a kitchen cabinet, the cooler becomes a refrigerator, a folding table becomes the neighborhood bar, and the parking space next door somehow becomes communal property the moment somebody offers a plate of wings. There's also something revealing beneath the spectacle. American sports culture is unusually comfortable inviting strangers into temporary communities. Nobody needs to know your last name before handing you a burger or asking where you traveled from. Wearing the right jersey can operate like a social password, while wearing the opposing one usually earns teasing rather than exile. That kind of openness can catch visitors off guard because international coverage of American sports often focuses on money, giant stadiums, celebrity halftime shows, and commercial spectacle. Those things certainly exist, yet standing outside a game reveals something much more ordinary and far more appealing: people using sports as an excuse to spend hours together. The numbers help explain why Americans build rituals around the experience. The National Football League regularly draws average crowds of roughly 69,000 fans per game, while major college football stadiums can seat more than 100,000. When that many people gather repeatedly, the event naturally becomes bigger than 90 minutes or 4 quarters. Americans did not merely build larger stadiums, they stretched the social life around the game until it begins hours earlier. For Europeans arriving because of the World Cup, that may become one of the unexpected reasons America feels easy to enjoy. You do not simply purchase admission and disappear into your assigned seat. The day unfolds around you, often before the gates matter at all. And there's something wonderfully American about turning infrastructure into hospitality. Europe perfected the walk from the pub to the stadium. Dallas looked at the parking lot and decided the party could start right there. History still breathes. Philadelphia creates a particularly awkward moment for anyone who arrives in America believing a young country must somehow have a shallow memory. The city has a habit of correcting that assumption before lunch, because here American history is not tucked behind velvet ropes like something the modern world has politely agreed to stop touching. It sits right in the middle of ordinary life. Independence Hall is where both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were debated and adopted, while the Liberty Bell remains only a short walk away. The National Park Service manages Independence National Historical Park across roughly 55 acres in central Philadelphia, meaning some of the country's most important political history is embedded directly into a functioning 21st century city rather than isolated in a distant monument complex. That matters more than it first appears. European visitors come from places where historical age can be almost casually intimidating. Rome can place a 2,000-year-old ruin beside somebody's morning espresso. York still carries sections of medieval walls. Prague can make a building from the 18th century feel suspiciously recent. Against that backdrop, America is often dismissed overseas as the new kid on the historical block, the country that arrived after everybody else had already chosen their castles. Philadelphia responds with a different argument entirely. America's power is not simply in how old the bricks are, but in how recognizable the ideas inside them remain. Freedom of speech, constitutional government, representative politics, limits on state power, and the difficult question of who gets included in those promises are still being argued about more than 2 centuries later. Walking through the places where those debates took physical shape makes American history feel unusually close, almost as if the paperwork never entirely dried. That can be addictive because it turns patriotism from an abstract slogan into geography. You can walk several blocks, buy lunch, hear traffic, pass office workers, and suddenly stand beside a building connected to decisions that reshape political thought far beyond the United States. There's no dramatic mountain separating past from present. Philadelphia simply lets the two share a sidewalk. The comparison with Europe becomes especially interesting here. Versailles represents the grandeur of monarchy with almost theatrical perfection. Westminster carries centuries of British political tradition. Philadelphia offers something visually humbler, and that modesty is part of its charm. Independence Hall is not a palace built to remind ordinary people how small they are. It is a brick building where men argued, compromised, disagreed, and eventually produced documents that would influence democratic movements around the world. Even the Liberty Bell works because it is imperfect. Its famous crack would be a warranty claim on almost anything else Americans buy, yet here the flaw became part of the symbol. that feels strangely fitting for a country whose history has always involved trying to make enormous ideals work through very human institutions. For Europeans arriving during the 2026 World Cup, Philadelphia can therefore provide a different kind of surprise from giant stadiums or American spectacle. The city quietly challenges the idea that the United States has little history worth lingering over. America may not have Roman aqueducts or medieval cathedrals on every corner, but it has places where modern political language was rewritten in ways much of the world still recognizes. That realization changes the mood of a visit. A traveler may come expecting soccer, cheesesteaks, and another American city on the itinerary, then leave understanding why Americans can become emotional about an old bell and a red brick building. Some nations inherit monuments from ancient empires. Philadelphia shows what happens when a country turns an argument about liberty into one. America's brain capital, Boston, has a funny way of ruining one particular stereotype before breakfast: the idea that America is all muscle, money, spectacle, and very little intellectual depth. Spend even a short time around Boston and Cambridge during the 2026 World Cup, and that picture becomes difficult to maintain. The city does not parade its academic culture like a museum exhibit. It simply lives inside it. Students fill coffee shops with laptops, research buildings sit beside ordinary neighborhoods, bookstores survive where another city might put a souvenir shop, and conversations about medicine, engineering, robotics, economics, or artificial intelligence can happen at the next table while somebody's trying to finish a bagel. The numbers explain why this atmosphere feels so concentrated. Greater Boston is home to more than 50 colleges and universities, while institutions such as Harvard, MIT, Boston University, Northeastern, Tufts, and Boston College sit within a relatively compact metropolitan area. Harvard was founded in 1636, only 16 years after the Mayflower arrived, which means organized higher education in Massachusetts began long before the United States itself existed. That tends to surprise Europeans for a simple reason. America is often described abroad as culturally young. Oxford began teaching centuries earlier, of course, while the University of Bologna dates back to the 11th century. Europe absolutely owns the category of university old enough to have seen several kingdoms disappear. Boston is playing a different game. Its appeal lies in how aggressively old academic traditions have been connected to new industries. Cross the Charles River into Cambridge and that becomes obvious. Kendall Square has developed one of the world's densest concentrations of biotechnology and life science companies, surrounded by laboratories, startups, major pharmaceutical firms, and MIT research. The atmosphere feels less like an ancient university quarter preserved for photographs, and more like somebody plugged a centuries-old academic culture directly into a wall socket. That is where Boston becomes unexpectedly addictive. Knowledge here is not treated as something reserved for professors behind oak doors, it spills into daily life. A student can study in a library older than several countries, take the subway across town, work inside a robotics laboratory, then watch a baseball game at Fenway that evening. America somehow allows all of those identities to occupy the same person without demanding that any of them become formal. This contrasts beautifully with parts of European academic culture, where historic universities often carry an unmistakable sense of tradition and ceremony. Oxford's colleges, Cambridge's courtyards, and Heidelberg's old university quarter can make scholarship feel almost architectural. Boston feels looser. Somebody inventing a medical device may be wearing sneakers, drinking iced coffee from a plastic cup the size of a flower vase, and complaining about the red line. The work can be world-class while the atmosphere remains wonderfully ordinary. That matters because international media often exports the loudest version of America. Political shouting travels well. Celebrity culture travels even better. A quiet laboratory developing cancer therapies does not usually dominate social media for 3 days. Boston reminds visitors how incomplete that picture can be. The United States spends more on research and development than any other country in absolute terms, according to OECD and National Science Foundation data, and the Boston area represents one of the places where that investment becomes visible at street level. Universities feed hospitals, laboratories feed startups, startups attract companies, and the whole ecosystem keeps producing reasons for ambitious people to stay. For a European visitor who arrived expecting football and a few historic buildings, that can become a very different kind of American seduction. Boston does not need to shout that America can think. It simply hands you a subway map, where half the stops seem to lead towards somebody trying to invent tomorrow. Maybe that is the real surprise behind all these crowded American cities. Europeans may arrive for the World Cup, but many leave with a completely different picture of the country than the one they carried across the Atlantic. America feels bigger, warmer, stranger, friendlier, and far more human up close. So which American city do you think would be hardest to leave after a month? Tell us below, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the America headlines rarely show.